Hello and welcome to this course. In this section, we'll be going over networking fundamentals, the foundations of Ethernet and Internet Protocol. In this video, we'll be going over some network terminology. These are need-to-know terms for your success as a network engineer or a network administrator. These terms are referenced somewhat often throughout the course and are not explained explicitly. It's important for you to commit these terms to memory and start thinking and speaking in these terms to make our conversations about networking topics more fluid. So let's get started. First up, collision domains. When a device transmits, the entire wire's voltage increases. So to understand a collision domain, we need to have a better understanding of fundamentally what happens when a device transmits onto a line. The ones and the zeros, our fundamental machine language, right? A 1 is generally represented by a high device voltage, or a high wire voltage, and a 0 would be represented by a low wire voltage. As we see here in time segment 1, device A, the green, has a wire voltage of 1 unit, being high, and device B has a wire voltage of 0 units, being low. So we could interpret that as device A transmitting a 1 and device B transmitting a 0 in that time slice. So a collision domain is a continuous electrically conductive wire. A hub, as indicated by our H device here in the larger circle section 1, connects multiple wires into a single collision domain, where a switch separates collision domains. Each of these circles and ovals represents a single collision domain. And in our graph, we have a 2-device collision domain. Where this is important is we could see that in every time segment, time 1, 2, 3, etc., we are able to determine who is transmitting by knowing if we put ourselves in the place of device A and we're watching the wire voltage, we can determine who is transmitting at any given time segment. At time segment 1, we know that only ourselves, only device A, is transmitting. At time segment 2, we know that we are transmitting and we see 2 units of voltage on the wire. So we know that the other device on the other end must also be transmitting. And at time segment 3, we see that nobody is transmitting on that line. Where this is important is in the following slide, we'll talk about duplex and what that means. But briefly, let's take a look at what a 3-device collision domain looks like. If we put ourselves in the shoes of device A, at time segment 1, we see that we know ourselves are transmitting, but we do see 2 units of voltage on the wire, and we know that there is more than one other device on the collision domain. And since there's 2 units of voltage on the wire, we're unable to determine who else on the collision domain is actually transmitting that other 1 unit. Similarly, for time segment 2, we know that we ourselves, device A, are still transmitting, and there's still 2 units of voltage on the wire. This could be that the same other device is still transmitting a 1. However, as we see in reality, the devices that are transmitting actually changed At first it was device C, and then it was device B. But device A is not able to determine that. So it can't piece together the ones and zeros into a continuous message to understand what is being said when multiple devices are transmitting and there are more than 2 devices in the collision domain. So the key takeaway in this slide, however, is that a hub connects multiple wires into a single collision domain. A switch will connect multiple wires into different collision domains. And router, just to mention it because it's here, also has separate collision domains. However, it's more important when we talk about broadcast domains at the end of this video. So to talk a little bit more about duplex. Duplex dictates whether a device may transmit and receive at the same time. When I was referencing are able to determine who is transmitting on the wire, that is referencing duplex. In a 2-device collision domain, since we are always able to determine who is transmitting, regardless of whether we are both transmitting or only one is, we are able to do full duplex. This means both devices may transmit and receive at the same time. However, if we are unable to determine who is transmitting when multiple devices transmit, then we negotiate to what is called half duplex. This means only one device may transmit on the line at a single time. If we see that there are multiple devices transmitting and we are at half duplex, then we encounter a collision. What Ethernet operates at is CSMA CD. What this is carrier sense multiple access collision detection. On our line, if we are operating at half duplex, if we see that there is a collision, then we undergo a backoff. All devices on the collision domain cease to transmit for a random amount of time, and then one will try to transmit again, and all the other devices listen to what it is saying, because only one device may transmit at a time on a half duplex link. To reference our diagram here again, in section 1, we would have half duplex because we have 4 devices here, our switch and 3 workstations. I'm not counting the hub as a device because in itself it does not transmit any actual traffic. It only connects our wires into a single collision domain. Now our switch in each of these other sections, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, these would operate at full duplex because only 2 devices would exist in each one of these collision domains, which is the advantage of using a switch over a hub, is that a switch, because it separates each link into its own collision domain, we have the ability for all of our devices to operate at full duplex. The key concept around a switch, though, is that it connects a broadcast domain. And what does that really mean here? Well, the difference between a hub and a switch we already know is that a hub creates a single collision domain and switches separate them into each port being its own collision domain. And a switch, though, logically connects all of our ports into a single broadcast domain. So a switch uses information in the Ethernet frame to retransmit or forward the information accordingly. A broadcast domain is defined by the devices that would receive an Ethernet broadcast. And we'll have to get a little later into this section when we talk about the layer 2 addressing and layer 2 fundamentals to understand what exactly a broadcast is. However, just know that all devices within a broadcast domain would receive a broadcast. So our router interface here and Workstation 2, Workstation 3, and all of these workstations in our hub's collision domain would receive a broadcast. Of course, assuming they're all in the same VLAN, and we will assume that here. We'll talk about that more later. But these would all receive a broadcast. A router, however, separates ports into different broadcast domains. So the key takeaway is that where a switch connects ports into the same broadcast domain but separates them into different collision domains, a router separates ports into different broadcast domains and different collision domains. And a hub connects ports into the same broadcast domain and same collision domain. Excellent. Thank you so much for going through that with me. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.